I never thought a Tuesday could feel like it carried the weight of a memory I hadn't lived yet. But there I was, under the flickering fluorescent lights of the little repair shop at the edge of town, watching her bend over a counter, her fingers tracing the edges of an old, scratched-out ledger. She wasn't supposed to be here, at least not in my world, but somehow she always appeared in the corners of it, like a shadow I wanted to reach for and couldn't. Her name was Marianne, my girlfriend's sister, and somehow that made every casual glance feel like trespassing. She moved with a kind of ease that made the world around her feel temporary, like even the dust motes suspended in the sunlight streaming through the dusty windows owed her attention. I tried not to notice how her hair caught the light, a rich dark chestnut that swung just enough to brush the curve of her jaw as she lifted her head to look at me. I was supposed to be fixing a motorbike that had been in for a week, but all I could do was watch her straighten up, wiping her hands on a faded apron, and feel my stomach tighten with the kind of awareness I didn't fully understand. She looked at me, just a quick, flickering glance, and then looked away. And yet, in that fraction of a second, I felt like she'd seen right into something I hadn't wanted anyone to notice. "Hey," I said, and immediately wanted to take it back. It sounded too casual, like I was trying to mask the flutter in my chest. She turned toward me fully this time, arching one eyebrow, lips tilting into something like amusement or skepticism. I wasn't sure which. "Hey," she said, and that single word made my brain seize for a moment. It wasn't the word itself. It was the way it landed, the way she let it hang in the air between us, soft but deliberate. There was a pause, awkward and electric, and I realized I didn't know what to say next. She leaned slightly over the counter, reaching for a cup of coffee that had gone cold somewhere during the morning. Her fingers brushed mine, briefly, unintentionally, or maybe not, but it made me flinch in a way that was both alarming and magnetic. She glanced down at the contact, then back at me, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. I wanted to ask if she felt it too, that small jolt, but the words stuck somewhere between my throat and my chest. Instead, I nodded at the motorbike, as if that explained everything about why I was standing here. She smiled, small and knowing, and muttered something about the engine needing more than just elbow grease. The way she said it, casual and confident, made me want to listen for hours. I watched her turn back to her work, and I noticed the way her shoulders moved, how the light caught her hands, how she seemed impossibly grounded in herself, and yet somehow aware of the tension she stirred in me. I should have been focused on the bike. I should have been thinking about my girlfriend, about boundaries, about the absurdity of this impossible fascination. But I wasn't. My mind kept circling back to that glance, that touch, that impossible fraction of a moment that felt like hours. And I knew, with a mixture of dread and thrill, that I would be replaying it for days, long after the motorbike was fixed, long after she left the shop, and long after I convinced myself I was imagining it all. Because that small, brief, accidental connection had planted something inside me that I didn't know how to name. And every time I closed my eyes, it was still there, like it had never really left. It was the second Thursday in a row that I found myself at the shop, though I had no excuse beyond wanting to see her. Marianne was there, leaning over the counter again, cataloging invoices with that same quiet intensity. This time, I was helping her sort out the shipment of parts, though most of the work fell to her fingers and her sharp eyes. I moved slowly around her, careful not to touch too much, careful not to breathe too loud, careful not to make my presence obvious. She didn't look up. She never did at first. I noticed the faint crease along her forehead, the tiny shake in her hand as she tried to line the invoices just so. It wasn't perfection. It was the exhaustion of someone who carried more than she let anyone see. I wanted to ask if she wanted a coffee, a break, anything, but my voice faltered somewhere between, maybe it's none of my business, and I can't not ask. "You want some help with the stack?" I said finally, trying to sound casual. Her hands paused. She looked at me, not exactly at me, more like she acknowledged I was there. There was a hesitation in her posture, the kind that made her seem both guarded and fragile at once. It's fine," she murmured, but I caught the way her voice wavered, a subtle crack that wasn't quite strength, not quite surrender. She adjusted her glasses and picked up another invoice. But the motion was slower now, a fraction more human, less impenetrable. I moved close, careful to keep a respectful distance, and noticed the small things. The curve of her wrist as she turned the paper, the faint calluses on her fingers, the way her eyes softened when she realized she hadn't dropped the pile. Her laugh broke out suddenly at some minor joke she muttered under her breath, and it was light, a little uneven, as if it needed permission to exist. I could feel my chest tighten, but I didn't dare smile back too quickly. She sighed, rubbing her temples with the heel of her hand. For a moment, she seemed entirely human, entirely exposed, and entirely magnetic. I wanted to reach out, to steady her, to be allowed to carry just a little of her weight, but the words never formed. Instead, I just watched, absorbing everything in silence, letting my eyes linger where my hands could not. Then, she looked up at me, really looked, and the pause lasted longer than it should. Her gaze carried a question, or maybe an invitation, or maybe just exhaustion, but it hit me with a pulse I couldn't name. I swallowed. She smiled faintly, like a secret she hadn't decided whether to share, and for a brief second, the distance between us seemed both enormous and irrelevant. I wanted to say something clever, something that would anchor the moment, but instead, I let it stretch, let it hover, letting the quiet energy between us do the work. Her fingers brushed mine, again, accidentally, maybe deliberately, and I caught the faint tremor in her hand. We didn't speak. We didn't move. We just existed in that sliver of shared space, and for the first time, I realized that what drew me to her wasn't just curiosity or admiration. It was the gentle pull of something forbidden, something unspoken, something that might never need words at all. Rain pelted the windows in thick sheets, making the repair shop feel like a small, isolated world. I was supposed to be leaving, but Marianne was still there, crouched over the engine of an old motorcycle that had seen better decades. The dim yellow light above her cast shadows across her face, highlighting the fine lines around her eyes and the soft curve of her jaw. I shouldn't have been standing there, but I couldn't bring myself to move. "I can't seem to get this spark plug out," she muttered, her hands smudged with oil, eyes squinting at the stubborn piece. I stepped closer, silently offering my presence more than my hands. She glanced up briefly, and our eyes locked, long enough that it was almost dangerous. The storm outside amplified the stillness, the world reduced to her gaze and the faint hum of fluorescent light. I cleared my throat. "Do you want me to try?" My voice sounded louder than I meant it to. She hesitated, caught between pride and necessity. Her lips parted, a soft sigh escaping before she shook her head. "No, I've got it. I just need a second." Her tone was fragile, but there was an edge of something unspoken, something she wasn't ready to say, or maybe wasn't supposed to. I knelt beside her, careful not to crowd her space, feeling the charged silence between us. Our knees brushed as I leaned slightly, just to get a better angle. She didn't pull away, and I felt the tension coil in my chest, tight and anxious. My mind screamed at me to stop thinking, to let this moment pass, but the electricity of proximity was impossible to ignore. The faint buzz of a phone interrupted the moment. She fumbled with it, muttering, "It's just a friend." The screen showed a name I didn't recognize, but the pause she took before swiping it away spoke volumes. External pressure had intruded, scattering the fragile tension between us like leaves in a sudden gust. I wanted to reach out, to say something that would make her lean toward me, to bridge that space, but my hands froze. The rational part of me screamed about boundaries, her sister, the absurdity of wanting what I shouldn't, and yet another part ached with desire and curiosity. Her hand brushed mine again, not deliberately, I told myself, but it lingered for a fraction longer than before. My pulse quickened, and I felt heat rising to my ears. Our proximity was intoxicating, dangerous in its subtlety. I wanted to speak, to confess the thought that had lodged itself in my mind, but no words would form without betraying too much. Instead, we froze, sharing the same breathing rhythm, the same suspended awareness that made seconds feel like hours. The storm outside thrashed harder, a loud crack of thunder reminding us that time moved on, that the world outside the shop demanded order and distraction. She finally straightened, shaking her head as if to clear the tension, and I stepped back, my fingers tingling where hers had grazed mine. Neither of us spoke of what had almost happened, what hovered in the air like an unclaimed promise. I left the shop that night with the rain still pounding, replaying the closeness, the hesitation, the nearly confessed thought that would not leave me, knowing it was a moment that existed only between us, ephemeral and electric. I didn't mean to stay behind after closing, but I found myself leaning against the counter while Marianne stacked a few last parts. The shop smelled of oil, wet asphalt, and the faint trace of her perfume, something warm, faintly floral, but not overpowering. The quiet between us had grown heavy, dense, almost tangible, like a fog pressing against my chest. She started, then stopped, glancing at me as if deciding whether she could say what was pressing in her throat. I kept still, letting her take the lead, though every fiber of me wanted to fill the silence with something, anything, to bridge the tension. She finally sighed, long and slow, and leaned back slightly, rubbing her temples. "Do you ever wonder what we're doing?" Her voice was soft, almost vulnerable, and it struck me harder than any words could have. Not asking for romance, not asking for clarity, just asking the question that had lodged itself between us for weeks. I blinked, caught off guard. My heart thudded in my chest, both anxious and achingly aware. I don't know, I admitted, because I didn't. I didn't know how to define what this was, this pull, this awareness, this constant hovering near something forbidden. She shifted, leaning forward a little, hands brushing the counter. "It's like, every time you're around, nothing feels normal. But it's not just you, either." Her eyes flicked down, then back up at me, and I realized she was as unmoored as I was. The usual guard, the confident exterior, had cracked. For a moment, she was just Marianne, flawed and tired and real. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice even. "I feel that too," I admitted. My hands itched to do something, to reach for her, to steady the unsteady, to claim the moment, but I didn't. Instead, I just watched her, memorizing the subtle twitch of her lips, the way her shoulders slumped ever so slightly, the way her eyes flickered with uncertainty. She let out a dry laugh, sharp and brief. "It's insane, isn't it?" she murmured. "Two people who shouldn't even this." She trailed off, and the pause stretched so long it hurt, filled only by the hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead and the faint drip of water from the roof. I started, then stopped. Words felt dangerous now. Even the simplest phrase could tip the balance of what had taken weeks to form. I realized, painfully, that neither of us could pretend this was normal anymore. That silence had become louder than touch, more honest than any casual smile or fleeting glance. She leaned back again, eyes dropping to the counter. "I don't know how to stop thinking about it," she said, almost to herself. Almost, but not entirely. The confession hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and thrilling at the same time. I wanted to answer, to tell her I felt it too, that the same thought had kept me awake night after night. But instead, I just nodded, and the weight of all the things unsaid pressed against my chest. Then, just as I thought the silence might break, she looked up at me, vulnerable in a way I had never seen before, and whispered, almost inaudibly, "Maybe we're already too far gone." I was stacking tools when Marian walked over, holding a small envelope, her fingers curling around it like it was fragile glass. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, the fluorescent light catching the faint lines around her eyes. I felt the familiar tug in my chest, the mix of curiosity and caution that had become its own kind of ache. "I found this," she said finally, her voice low, hesitant. She set it on the counter between us. The handwriting was familiar to her, I could tell, though I didn't recognize it. Her thumb traced the edge as if memorizing the weight of it, the texture, the significance. "Does it hurt?" I asked, not knowing why I even said it. She looked at me then, a flicker of something vulnerable in her eyes. She shrugged, the motion small but deliberate, as if to say she didn't know, or maybe she didn't want to admit she did. "It's from a long time ago," she murmured. "Someone I cared about. Thought I'd never see this again." She paused, biting her lip, and I realized she was holding back more than just words. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside was a faded photograph, a small note tucked behind it. She let the photo fall onto the counter. It was her, years younger, laughing in a sunlit park with a man whose face she had evidently loved and lost. I noticed her fingers hover over it, brushing the edges, and the faintest shadow of pain crossed her face. "I didn't think about him for years," she said, almost to herself. "Then you. I don't know. It's strange. Seeing you, being around you. It's like he's everywhere and nowhere at once." I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly, but the sudden realization of the depth she had carried inside her hit me like a quiet tremor. I wanted to say something comforting, but I didn't know if words could reach what she was holding inside. "You remind me of him," she whispered, almost too fast, like she hadn't intended to. Her eyes widened slightly, as if realizing she'd admitted something she didn't mean to. I wanted to back away, wanted to erase the weight of her confession with a joke or a gesture, but instead, I stayed still. "I do," I asked quietly, my voice low, careful. It was the truth, I did. Not in appearance, not in age, but in some intangible thread that connected her past sorrow with the present tension. She nodded slowly, a shiver running through her shoulders. "It's not fair to you," she said, eyes dropping to the counter. "It's complicated. And yet, I can't ignore it." Her fingers lingered near mine, and the almost touch felt like the spark before a storm, small but undeniable. I swallowed, trying to keep my pulse from giving me away. We didn't speak for a long moment, just existed side by side, suspended in the quiet after her confession. Something had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, like the air in the room had changed its weight. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes soft but trembling, and whispered, barely audible, "I didn't expect you to see this side of me." And in that single line, I felt the ground beneath everything we'd known tilt just enough to make the future uncertain and impossibly magnetic. The shop smelled of rain and motor oil that evening, a comforting, ordinary scent that suddenly felt intimate. Mary Ann and I were crouched on opposite sides of a dismantled engine, hands smeared with grease, shoulders brushing as we worked in silence. I could feel her near me, not in some dramatic way, but in a quiet, undeniable presence that settled over everything. She paused, wiping her hands on a rag, and looked at me. No words were needed. There was a flicker of acknowledgement, a recognition of the tension that had been threading through our days for weeks. Her eyes softened, not flinching, not pulling back, just softened, like she was letting me see the part of her she'd kept hidden. I don't want this to be messy," she murmured. It wasn't a confession of love, but an admission that what was happening between us mattered, that it existed and could not be ignored. I nodded, because I understood completely. I wasn't here for drama, for a fleeting thrill. I was here because something between us had quietly taken root and refused to be denied. We worked on the engine in tandem, hands occasionally brushing over the same piece, each touch brief but electric. I caught myself noticing the subtle details, her knuckles dusted with dirt, the faint tremor when she tightened a bolt, the way her hair fell loose after she'd pushed it back once too often. And she noticed me noticing, though she didn't say anything. At one point, the shop lights flickered, and she shivered slightly. Without thinking, I lifted a hand to her arm, brushing it gently. She didn't flinch. Instead, her eyes met mine, and the smallest exhale escaped her lips. That fleeting contact, the brush of our skin, the unspoken permission in her glance, said everything that words couldn't. We moved closer as we packed the tools away, not in a rush, not in a leap, but in a quiet inevitability. The storm outside had passed, leaving only the soft drip of water from the roof. She leaned against the counter, I against the engine, and for a moment, we just existed in the same space. The distance between us finally measured not in hesitation, but in mutual understanding. "Are we okay?" I asked softly. It wasn't a question of love or romance, just confirmation that we could exist in this newfound awareness without wrecking what we already were. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible tilt of her head, and smiled faintly. "We're okay," she said, as if agreeing to a truth that had been there all along. And then, almost imperceptibly, our hands touched, just the tips of our fingers brushing together as we set the last tool down. No fireworks, no declarations, no sudden motion. Just a quiet, steady contact that said, "We're here. This is real. We belong here, in this moment." I exhaled slowly, and she mirrored me. The tension dissolved, replaced by a still, intimate clarity. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight lift, not with a grand gesture, but with the simplicity of shared space, quiet understanding, and the smallest touch that somehow said more than either of us could put into words. And in that calm, I realized, some things don't need to be spoken to be true. I still remember that evening at the shop, though it's been months now. Time has a way of softening the edges, making the moments feel both distant and unbearably close at once. I often think back, not just to what happened, but to the way it felt to exist in that tiny, ordinary space with her. Marianne, my girlfriend's sister, and somehow, impossibly, my quiet obsession that had grown into something more real than I ever expected. It wasn't dramatic, not in the way you read about in books or see in movies. There were no confessions shouted across rain-soaked streets, no sudden declarations of love. Just proximity, shared silences, small gestures that carried weight far beyond their size. A brush of fingers over grease-dusted skin. A glance held just a second too long. The way she exhaled, the way I learned to notice her pauses, her quiet laughter, the subtle tremor in her hand when she was caught between pride and vulnerability. I've changed. I've learned patience, the kind that isn't forced but chosen. I've learned that love isn't always about possession or urgency. It can be quiet, insistent in its gentleness, earned in shared moments rather than grand gestures. I've learned to be still, to wait, and to let someone exist fully in their own complexity without trying to fix or claim them. And Marianne, she changed too, in ways I saw only when the light caught her just right, or when she spoke softly and allowed herself to be raw in a way that felt dangerous and beautiful all at once. She allowed someone else, me, to witness her history, her grief, her laughter, without needing to hide behind the confident, composed exterior she'd always worn. There's a freedom in that, a kind of courage I don't think I fully appreciated at first. What we built together wasn't perfect. It was slow, flawed, real. It taught us both something about the nature of connection, that intimacy doesn't always arrive with fireworks, that desire and care can coexist quietly, that boundaries and respect can make the eventual closeness even more profound, that sometimes love is simply showing up and noticing and letting someone see all the parts of you usually hide. I catch myself smiling sometimes when I think about her, the way she leans on her elbows, the tilt of her head when she's considering something, the way silence between us no longer feels like a wall, but a bridge. Those little things have become sacred markers of what we discovered, that intimacy can be as much about restraint as release, and that closeness is a choice made repeatedly, quietly, and gently. And though the story of US didn't arrive with dramatic fanfare, it arrived exactly where it needed to, slow, earned, and wholly human. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?